Do you also cry because you're starving? The tiny voice cut through the storm like a blade, pulling Richard Coleman back from the abyss of his grief. He had been kneeling in the middle of the rain-soaked avenue, his $1,000 suit drenched, his heart hollow from losing custody of his son, when the words landed with a weight heavier than all the billions he owned. He raised his tear-swollen eyes and saw her, a barefoot girl, no more than 10, with tangled hair plastered to her forehead, and a crust of stale bread clutched tightly in her hand. Her name was Amara, though he didn't know it yet. Her clothes were rags, her skin shivered from the cold, yet her gaze was steady, almost piercing, as if she had seen more cruelty than a child ever should. She extended half of her bread toward him with trembling fingers. "Here, you can have some," she whispered. For an instant, Richard, the celebrated millionaire of Wall Street, felt smaller than this fragile child who had nothing, yet offered everything. He could not answer at first. His throat was locked by both shame and sorrow. "No, little one," he managed finally. "My hunger is of another kind." Amara tilted her head, her voice wise beyond her years. "Then it must be the hunger of missing someone. My grandmother said there are only two kinds of tears, hunger tears and missing tears." The truth of her words sliced into him. How could a homeless child see what no boardroom psychologist had ever understood about him? In that storm, under the indifferent glare of the city lights, a bond formed that neither could explain. And now I ask you, if a child with nothing offered you her only piece of bread, what would you do? Would you accept it, or would you walk away? Richard Coleman had spent his entire adult life climbing to the highest towers of power. Yet as he stood dripping wet beneath the relentless Manhattan rain, it was the voice of a ragged child that pierced him deeper than any hostile takeover or court ruling ever had. He studied her carefully now, his heart torn between disbelief and wonder. How could a child so young speak with such clarity? Her eyes seemed to carry storms of their own, but storms tempered by resilience, the kind only forged through survival. He cleared his throat, forcing his voice to steady. "What's your name?" The girl clutched her piece of bread tighter, as if names were treasures to be guarded. But then she said softly, "Amara." The name lingered in the air, fragile yet unbreakable. Richard nodded, almost as though he was bowing to the weight of that name. "Amara, I'm Richard." She studied his face with suspicion and curiosity, as though she were trying to decide if this broken man before her was worthy of the gift she had just offered. Richard felt strangely compelled to explain himself, though he owed no explanation to the suits of Wall Street, nor to the partners who sat at mahogany tables with him. Yet before this child, stripped of all pretense, he found himself confessing. "I miss my son," he whispered, his voice raw. "He lives across the ocean now, and today marks 1 year since I last held him." Amara tilted her head, and her lips curved into something that was almost a smile, but carried too much sadness to fully bloom. "Then we both miss someone," she murmured. Richard's breath caught. He hadn't expected the words to echo so perfectly with his own grief. He asked gently, "And who do you miss?" Her eyes darkened, and for a moment the little girl seemed to age by decades. "My mother," she said flatly. "She vanished 6 months ago. One day she was cleaning offices in one of those tall buildings, and then she was gone. No one came back for me." Richard felt a chill slice through him. Something about her tone, about the stark simplicity of the statement, unsettled him. "Gone?" he pressed softly. Amara nodded, her gaze drifting toward the skyscraper behind them. "An elegant lady gave her chocolates. After that, she was different. The next day, men in suits said they were taking her to a doctor. She never returned." Lightning flashed above the skyline, and Richard's chest tightened. A memory stirred. Reports of a cleaning woman dismissed for breaching confidentiality, whispers of someone who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Could it be? He stared at Amara, at her thin shoulders, at the courage it must have taken for her to survive 6 months alone on these merciless streets. He crouched so their eyes were level, and despite the rain soaking through every thread of his suit, he reached out with words instead of hands. "You shouldn't be alone out here," he said gently. Amara's jaw tightened, and she gave a defiant shrug. "I always manage. The city has corners for people like me, overpasses, warm grates, places where the rain doesn't find you. Richard felt his heart ache. He could not bear the thought of his own son in such conditions. Come with me, he said suddenly. I'll give you a hot meal, a safe place tonight. Nothing more, I promise. Her eyes narrowed sharply, suspicion flashing in them. She had clearly been taught by hardship not to trust easily. Why? She demanded, her small voice carrying the gravity of a courtroom judge. Why would you do that for me? The question landed with the weight of truth. Richard blinked, then answered with the only words that made sense. Because you shared your bread with me when you thought I was hungry. Because today is the loneliest day of my life, and you reminded me I am not alone. And because no child should spend the night out here in the cold. Amara studied him for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. Okay, but if you try anything strange, I'll run, and I'll scream so loud the whole city will hear. Despite the heaviness in his chest, Richard almost smiled. Fair enough, he said, rising and holding out his hand. Side by side, the millionaire and the beggar child walked through the wet streets, neither aware that this unlikely encounter was about to unravel secrets neither could have imagined. Richard's apartment overlooked Central Park, its towering windows glowing against the storm outside. But as he guided Amara into the warm interior, the contrast between the marble floors and her bare feet pierced him more deeply than the chill of the rain ever could. She stopped just inside the doorway, wide-eyed, as if she had stepped into another world entirely. Her fingers brushed the polished wood of the grand piano and she whispered, "It's like the movies, where rich people live." Richard forced a smile, though inside the opulence mocked him. All the wealth in the world had not kept his son by his side, nor filled the cavern in his heart. He gently suggested she take a hot shower while he prepared something simple to eat. While Amara disappeared into the guest bathroom, Richard made calls he had never imagined he would need to make. His lawyer, Samuel Grant, agreed to come over immediately, his voice sharpened with worry when Richard mentioned a missing child and possible connections to FinTech Holdings. His head of security, Elena Park, once an FBI agent, promised to send over records of all contract cleaning staff in the last 2 years. Richard hung up the phone, the weight of suspicion pressing heavier with each breath. When Amara emerged from the bathroom, her hair damp and clean, her face fresh, she looked like another child entirely. Yet something about her features nagged at his memory, an unsettling familiarity he could not place. He served her a bowl of hot soup, watching as she ate cautiously, as though afraid it might vanish if she took too much. "Amara," he said gently, "do you remember your mother's full name?" She looked up, her dark eyes sharp. "Lydia Brown. Everyone called her Liddy." Richard froze. The name struck him like thunder. He remembered seeing it, written in an HR report he had skimmed over weeks ago. Termination for breach of confidentiality. He nearly dropped his spoon. "Lydia Brown worked in this very building," he muttered under his breath, half to himself. "What floor?" Amara frowned, trying to recall. She said it was always high up, where the doors were heavy and important voices argued behind them. She said she could sometimes hear things through the cracks. Richard's pulse quickened. The 42nd floor, the executive meeting suite. Only a handful of people had unrestricted access there. Himself, Margaret Ellison, his vice president and mentor, along with 2 other directors. His stomach turned to stone. Amara's voice broke into his racing thoughts. "The lady with the chocolates," she said slowly. She had gray hair, tied in a bun, wore glasses that sparkled. She always talked down to my mom, like she was a child. "Is that someone you know?" Richard nearly dropped his cup. The description was too precise to ignore. Margaret Ellison, the woman who had guided him for 15 years, who had whispered strategies that built his empire, who had just last month pressured him to sell his majority stake. Richard's heart pounded, a surge of betrayal and dread, mixing like poison in his veins. Amara leaned forward, her small fingers clutching the edge of the table. "Mr. Richard," she asked quietly, "do you think the woman who gave my mother chocolates is the same one who works with you?" The question, so direct, carried more weight than any courtroom accusation. Richard swallowed hard. He wanted to protect this child from the darkness, yet he could not lie. "It's possible," he admitted softly. "And if it's true, then we'll find out what really happened to your mother." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Samuel Grant had arrived, ready to listen. Richard felt the walls of his carefully built empire begin to tremble. What had started as a chance encounter in the rain was now spiraling into something far more sinister. Samuel Grant stepped into Richard's apartment with the air of a man accustomed to walking into courtrooms where lives and fortunes dangled by a thread. Tall and sharp-featured, his gray eyes flicked immediately to Amara, who was sitting with folded hands at the dining table, her small body dwarfed by the grandeur around her. Richard wasted no time. He recounted everything he had heard: the chocolates, Lydia Brown's disappearance, the description of Margaret Ellison. Samuel listened without interruption, only scribbling occasional notes in his leather-bound pad. But Richard could see the tension settle in his jaw. When Richard finished, silence hung between them, broken only by the storm battering the windows. Samuel finally spoke. "If what this child is saying is accurate, Richard, we may be staring at something far larger than an internal dispute. We may be looking at conspiracy, witness elimination, possibly corporate crimes on an international scale." Richard felt his chest tighten. He had spent years believing Margaret was his ally, the guiding hand who helped him transform a fledgling startup into a financial titan. Could it be that she had been weaving her own empire in the shadows? Before Richard could respond, his phone vibrated. Elena Park's message appeared. Records attached. Note 1 termination date matches disappearance. Hard hammering, Richard opened the file. There it was in black and white. Lydia Brown, terminated on the exact day Amara said her mother vanished. Reason: breach of confidentiality protocol. His vision blurred with rage. Elena's second note chilled him further. 3 other employees dismissed under similar claims in past 2 years, all assigned to 42nd floor. Richard passed the tablet to Samuel, who raised his brows grimly. "Patterns like this don't lie. This isn't negligence. It's deliberate." Richard's mind reeled. He remembered Margaret's words only weeks ago, urging him to consider selling his stake before compromising information surfaced. At the time, he had dismissed it as boardroom pressure. But now, was that information not about him at all, but about her own corruption? Samuel leaned forward. If Lydia overheard sensitive conversations, Margaret would have every motive to silence her. Poisoned chocolates, removal by hired men, then erasure under the guise of termination. Classic playbook of power protecting itself. Amara's small voice interrupted, steady and haunting. "My mother always told me that powerful people do bad things when they think nobody's watching." Both men turned to her, stunned by the clarity of her words. Richard felt both pride and sorrow. This child had endured lessons no one her age should learn. "She was writing things down," Amara added suddenly, "in a notebook. She said if she ever forgot, the notebook would remember for her. She hid it before they took her." Richard's pulse spiked. "Do you know where it is?" Amara hesitated, then nodded. "I kept it safe. It's in a place nobody looks." Samuel's eyes lit with cautious hope. "If that notebook contains records of what she overheard, Richard, it could be the weapon we need." Richard clenched his fists, his grief sharpening into something colder, more precise: resolve. He had allowed himself to wallow in sorrow for too long, a father mourning his son, a man dulled by despair. But now, standing in his home with this orphan girl who had handed him her last piece of bread, he felt something awaken. He was no longer merely Richard Coleman, the grieving millionaire. He was a man staring directly into the machinery of corruption that had stolen a mother from her child. Samuel's voice cut into his thoughts. "You need to understand, Richard, if Margaret Ellison is involved in laundering or international fraud, she won't hesitate to escalate. She's already proven that she can eliminate liabilities. Bringing this to light will put a target not only on you, but on this child." Richard glanced at Amara, who met his gaze without flinching. There was fear in her, yes, but also unshakable courage. "Then let her put a target on me," Richard said quietly, "because I promise you, Samuel, this time she underestimated the wrong man." Outside, thunder rolled over Manhattan as if the heavens themselves acknowledged the shift. The storm had not passed, it had only begun. The following morning, While the city awoke to the rhythm of taxis and sirens, Amara sat at Richard's dining table with a seriousness far beyond her years. She had barely touched the toast he had made, her gaze fixed on her hands folded tightly in her lap. Finally, in a voice so low it was nearly drowned out by the hum of the refrigerator, she whispered, "I think I still have what my mother left behind." Richard leaned closer, every muscle tense. "What is it, Amara?" Her dark eyes lifted, haunted yet steady. "Her notebook. She said when you hear things you shouldn't, you have to write them down so you don't forget. I took it with me the night they came for her." Richard's breath caught. Samuel Grant nearly dropped his coffee, and even Elena Park, who had joined them quietly that morning, stiffened at the words. "Where is it now?" Richard asked, his tone urgent but gentle. Amara hesitated, then replied, "I hid it, in a place no one would ever check, an old subway tunnel near Lexington. I didn't want anyone to find it because I knew it was important." Richard's heart hammered. This could be the thread that unraveled everything. They decided to retrieve it immediately. Wrapped in his long coat, Richard followed Amara through winding streets and alleys he never would have dared walk alone. The millionaire, accustomed to boardrooms and penthouses, now trudged behind a 10-year-old who navigated the shadows like a soldier. She led them to a rusted grate half hidden behind debris. With effort, they pried it open and crawled into a forgotten tunnel that smelled of damp stone and iron. Amara knelt by a pile of old rags and pulled free a faded backpack. Her small hands trembled as she unzipped it and withdrew a worn, hardcover notebook. She pressed it against her chest for a moment, as though feeling her mother's heartbeat within its pages, then handed it to Richard. His fingers shook as he opened it. Inside, line after line of Lydia Brown's neat handwriting chronicled dates, times, and conversations overheard while cleaning the executive meeting room. Richard read aloud, his voice thick with disbelief and fury. October 23rd, meeting with men speaking with Russian accents. Discussed moving $50 million through offshore accounts. November 15th, Margaret arguing on the phone with someone named Martinez. Threatened that accidents happen to people who talk too much. December 2nd, showed photos of Cayman Island accounts to unidentified man. Laughed, said Richard would never suspect because he trusts her like a sister. Richard's grip on the book tightened until his knuckles blanched. Samuel whistled softly, his lawyer's instincts already tallying charges. "This isn't circumstantial, Richard. This is evidence of conspiracy, money laundering, threats of violence. If authenticated, this could bury her." Elena scanned the pages quickly, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "There's more at the end," she murmured, flipping to the final entry. Richard leaned in and his stomach dropped as he read Lydia's last words. January 15th. Margaret discovered I have been listening. She gave me chocolates today, said they were special. They tasted bitter, feeling dizzy. If anything happens, Amara is with the neighbor. Please, someone take care of my little girl. Silence filled the tunnel, broken only by the distant rumble of a train somewhere far above. Amara's lip trembled, but she did not cry. She seemed beyond tears. Instead, she looked straight at Richard. She knew, didn't she? She knew they would hurt her. Richard knelt before her, his voice shaking but firm. "Your mother was brave, Amara. Brave enough to leave the truth behind so that one day someone could bring justice. She trusted you to protect it, and you did. You saved her voice." Samuel closed the notebook carefully, as though it were a sacred artifact. "This is enough to bring the FBI crashing through Margaret's doors," he said. But Richard's mind was already racing further. Margaret had played a long, cunning game, but now the board had shifted. For years she had underestimated him, treating him as a protege, a figurehead she could manipulate. Now, with a single worn notebook held by a child who had nothing left but courage, Richard had the weapon that could end her empire. Yet even as determination burned in him, fear gnawed at the edges. Margaret was ruthless. If she discovered they had this notebook, she would stop at nothing to silence them. Richard placed a protective hand on Amara's shoulder, feeling the fragile strength beneath her thin frame. "We'll use this," he vowed softly, "not just to expose her, but to make sure your mother comes back to you. And if Margaret thinks she can destroy us the way she destroyed others, she's about to learn that she miscalculated." For the first time since his son had been taken overseas, Richard felt the fire of purpose flood back into his soul. He was no longer a grieving father lost in the rain. He was a man preparing for battle, and this time he would not lose. The boardroom of FinTech Holdings gleamed with sterile perfection that morning, its long mahogany table polished to a mirror, the Manhattan skyline blazing through glass walls. Margaret Ellison entered first, her gray hair twisted into its usual severe bun, her tailored suit radiating authority. She carried a briefcase brimming with documents she believed would seal Richard's downfall. Around the table, directors murmured in low tones, their pens poised to sign whatever verdict she handed them. Richard sat at the far end, composed yet coiled, Samuel Grant at his side, Elena Park waiting silently near the back. Only Richard knew that this was not his trial, but Margaret's reckoning. Margaret's voice sliced through the room with rehearsed precision. Gentlemen, we are gathered to address a grave failure of leadership. Mr. Coleman's decisions have endangered our reputation with international investors. It is time for a change at the helm. She opened her briefcase with theatrical flourish, spreading papers across the table. Evidence of questionable transfers, improvised contracts, reckless partnerships, all of it tied to Richard's negligence. I move for a vote of no confidence. The directors exchanged uneasy glances, yet many nodded, intimidated by her tone. Richard rose slowly, his calmness disarming. How fascinating, Margaret, he said softly, that you accuse me of compromising our investors, when in fact you've been conducting secret meetings with foreign criminal syndicates. Margaret froze, her confident mask flickering for the first time. What nonsense is this? She snapped. Richard gave a subtle nod to Samuel, who pressed a button on the projector. The first page of Lydia Brown's notebook appeared on the screen. The neat handwriting chronicled names, dates, illegal transfers, and whispered threats. Richard's voice was ice as he read aloud. October 23rd, Margaret met with men with Russian accents. Discussed laundering $50 million through shell companies. November 15th, Margaret warned Martinez that accidents happen to those who talk too much. December 2nd, Margaret showed Cayman Island accounts to a man in gray suit, laughing that Richard trusted her like a sister. The directors stiffened in their seats, murmurs rising like waves. Margaret's face paled. Fabrications, she spat. Anyone could have written that notebook. Samuel's lips curved into a predator's smile. Then perhaps the recordings will convince you. Elena tapped her tablet, and suddenly the room filled with Margaret's unmistakable voice. Her clipped tone discussed hidden accounts, offshore transactions, and strategies for silencing employees who overheard too much. Every syllable cut like a blade, undeniable and damning. Gasps erupted around the table. Margaret staggered a step backwards, her hands clutching the edge of the table. This is entrapment, she stammered. You invaded my privacy. Richard's eyes flashed with fury. You invaded far more than privacy, Margaret. You poisoned an employee, tore a mother from her child, and thought no one would ever know. But you forgot the simplest truth. Even shadows leave records. The doors burst open, and two federal agents strode in, badges gleaming. Margaret Ellison, one intoned, you are under arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, attempted murder, and child endangerment. Margaret spun toward Richard, desperation etched into every line of her face. Richard, please, we built this company together. You need me. You can't survive without me. Richard's gaze was unflinching. What I need, he said coldly, is a company free from corruption, in a world where children like Amara don't lose their mothers to monsters like you. The agent snapped handcuffs around her wrists, and she thrashed wildly, papers spilling from her briefcase in a storm of lies. You're making a mistake, she screamed as she was dragged from the room. I taught you everything. Richard's voice followed her down the corridor, steady and final. And you taught me to recognize what evil looks like when it wears a mentor's smile. The room fell silent. Every director stared at Richard, the man they had underestimated for years, now standing as both accuser and savior. He straightened his shoulders, his voice carrying with quiet authority. Gentlemen, I apologize for allowing corruption to fester here. But from this day forward, FinTech Holdings will be rebuilt on transparency and justice. At the back, Elena slipped him a discreet nod. The plan had worked flawlessly, but Richard knew the battle wasn't fully over. Margaret had been removed, yes, but the truth about Lydia's fate still lay in the shadows. Tonight, he promised himself, Amara would hear that her mother was not forgotten. Justice had begun, but the real fight, the fight for family, was only just awakening. 3 months later, sunlight streamed across Richard Coleman's garden, where laughter replaced the echoes of sorrow. Amara ran barefoot through the grass, her hand clasped tightly in her mother's. Lydia Brown, who had been rescued from the clinic where she had been kept under false pretenses. Lydia's eyes, once dulled by sedation, now shone with renewed strength as she watched her daughter skip with joy. Richard stood by the porch, arms folded, a quiet smile spreading across his face as he absorbed the sight he had feared might never come. For years he had believed his wealth defined him, but no transaction, no empire, had ever given him the peace that this moment offered. He remembered Margaret's desperate words in the boardroom, her plea that he needed her to survive, and the irony struck him now with gentle clarity. Survival had never been about power, but about love and the bonds no corruption could sever. Amara broke away from her mother and dashed toward Richard, flinging her arms around his waist. "Daddy Richard," she cried, her voice ringing with unfiltered joy. "Mommy said I can choose the colors for my new room." The words struck him deeper than any boardroom victory. Daddy Richard, two simple words that filled the hollow left by years of loneliness. Lydia joined them, her expression softened with gratitude. "I never imagined," she whispered, "that after so much loss, I would find not only my daughter, but a family." Richard's heart swelled. For so long he had been consumed by grief, blinded by boardroom wars, but through the courage of a child who offered him her last piece of bread, he had found redemption. Margaret Ellison sat in a federal prison now, stripped of power and wealth, her empire of lies reduced to ashes. But Richard understood that true revenge had never been about her destruction. It was about building something she could never comprehend, a life rooted in love, trust, and honesty. He tightened his arm around Amara and Lydia, vowing silently that no storm would ever tear them apart again. "And now I ask you, what do you think is worth more, billions in the bank or the unshakable bond of family?" Share your thoughts below, because your answer may reveal what wealth truly means.